Hi, folks. This is Mark Knutson. Welcome to Disability Landscape, a presentation of Disability Channel Minnesota. I'm very excited today, actually, to have Scott Artley, who is the Accessibility Program Director with the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Great. Thank you for having me.
And just to start off, what is the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council?
Sure. So the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council, which is also known as MRAC, our acronym, is a state-funded regional arts council, meaning in Minnesota there are 11 regions where state dollars that have been set aside by the Minnesota legislature to be distributed to these 11 regions. So we are the Twin Cities metropolitan region, which means that we are in charge of distributing dollars that come from both state appropriation from the legislature, so money that the state sets aside, says, hey, we think arts are important, so we're going to set aside some dollars out of the general budget to ensure that arts activities can happen. And the legacy grants, the Legacy Fund, which was a special fund that came out in 2008 based on the vote of the people to increase sales tax by a small percentage to fund arts activities, among other sort of arts and culture heritage and land and water initiatives. So we are in charge of distributing a portion of that money to artists and arts organizations in the Twin Cities.
Okay. And then to talk a little bit about yourself, I guess I'd like to kind of touch back when we first met, which was a few years ago. You were, I forget but you were with Patrick's Cabaret, correct? And what was your position at that time with Patrick's Cabaret?
Sure. When we met, I was the performing arts curator, and one of the new shows that I started at Patrick's Cabaret, I think this was I think I started in 2014 and it happened in 2015 and 2016
Sounds about,
also. Yeah. We did a special cabaret featuring artists with disabilities called Cabaretable. And we had, so we had artists involved. Yeah, we did it for a number of years.
Okay. Yeah, and it was interesting because one of the artists that performed there was Sam Jasmine, and a visually impaired lady, and she just had a real funny bit at that weekend where her and another visually impaired person were sitting in a car talking, which just made it comical to visually impaired people in a car. And we just talked to her recently, and I told her, I just thought, her timing and how that worked out was just real funny in that. But then from Patrick's Cabaret, how did you end up to the position that you're in now then?
Well, so I've, over the years, also worked as a consultant with arts organizations and sort of developed this niche expertise and accessibility for people with disabilities as it specifically relates to arts and cultural organizations. So flash forward a few years from when I first met you, Mark, and I saw a posting at MRAC for a job, Accessibility Program Director. And this job is specifically about stewarding a new grant program supporting accessibility for people with disabilities in the arts, and to work with MRAC on sort of expanding the internal capacity of the organization to better serve people with disabilities, whether that means looking at, literally rearranging furniture in our panel room to make sure that wheelchairs could get through and other mobility devices, and to help expand the capacity of our region's arts and cultural institutions more broadly by doing things like hosting workshops such as the DIY ADA access planning workshop that I hosted earlier this year. So those are sort of the grant program, internal sort of resource development to better serve people with disabilities at MRAC, and then to work with arts organizations in our region to expand their ability to serve people with disabilities, usually through education.
Yeah, because you had just now back in June, I believe you awarded 10 to 12 grants, and your grants kind of fall, when I briefly kind of looked at it, they fall in two categories, because what you're trying to do with the way it looks like is you're there to help for the physical access, getting the artists, the people physically able to get into the facilities, and once they're in there, being able to enjoy it for the hearing impaired and that. But then you also have programs that you help out that, like you say, workshops for the actual artists to do their artist activities, and that correct?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good. I also want to just back up and say I would be remiss if I didn't bring up VSA Minnesota,
Oh, correct. Yep.
in relationship to these grants. So for about 10 years, MRAC used to give VSA Minnesota a pool of money for them to distribute in grants. Those were ADA improvement grants. And so as VSA Minnesota sunsetted, about a year ago, that pool of resources came back into MRAC, and so my position was hired as the one to manage that grant program. And so we did a lot of research in the arts and disability community to really figure out what do folks want out of this grant program. And so what we developed is the Access Improvement Grant Program, which is, it stands on the shoulders of what BSA did, and also, made some changes to update for, 10 years later after BSA had done all this work. So the focus of this program is really about increasing access and participation of people with disabilities in the arts. So in addition to the things you talked about, ensuring buildings are up to ADA code, ensuring that folks have access to the communications tools that they need to be able to participate, we also really emphasize that in the end, it's about ensuring that people with disabilities can actively participate in arts activities. So it's not enough, and I said this over and over in all of our workshops and working with applicants, it's not enough to simply create the means of access. There needs to be active participation. There have to be people using the means of access that you're providing. So that's what I think was very exciting about the 12 grants that were made, is even if it were, installing new doors,
Right.
those were about ultimately the active participation. And so these groups have active participation, getting folks in to actually use these amenities.
Okay. And then if you would you like to then talk about some of the grant winners and the programs that are involved in that?
Sure. Yeah, so there's a good mixture of projects that folks received funding for. Young Dance in St. Paul got funding to install automatic door openers. So that's an example of like a capital activity. Similarly, Rum River Art Center also we want to install a ramp so that folks can get into our building. But then there are a number of things like the Lakeville City Ballet, which is also known now as the Twin Cities Ballet of Minnesota, is getting funding to perform a sensory-friendly version of a Minnesota Nutcracker. So having adaptations to the ways that they usually produce something to make it more accessible to folks with sensory processing disorders. One thing that I'm especially excited about, not to play favorites, but I am I'm very interested in off-leash areas funding to launch a new performance program that's called Off Kilter, which is supporting and showcasing artists with disabilities in the community. So that's a really exciting project. But really, all of these, in so many ways, are looking very holistically about how they know that there are existing barriers to participation,
Right.
and finding ways to ensure that that they get folks in the doors, or in the rehearsal room, or in the outdoor spaces, I think is happening more and more this year.
Yeah, and that that's really the key is well, let's just say kind of that first step, making your places accessible so artists with disabilities can get in there and partake in the programs that are being offered, and and that. So any other grant winners that kind of stick out in your mind that
Yeah, the Upstream Arts, fabulous organization based in Minneapolis, is going to be doing ask for equipment purchases so that they can do on-camera training for teaching artists to develop new online programs. So I think as these grants were coming in, we had a lot of a lot of things were changing. The deadline was at the end of March, and this was a period where we were all just figuring out what is this new normal, right? So that's an example of an organization that was like, let's move to an online format. Yeah, and then there's activities, cow tipping press, reducing the cost of creative writing classes for 4 organizations serving people of color with disabilities. So just acknowledging that the disability justice or the disability rights movement, has historically been very centered around the white disabled experience. So
right,
reflecting, the move toward disability justice as an intersectional movement to integrate the multiple oppressions of people with disabilities who might also have experience oppression because of race or sexuality, anything like that. So anyway, that's another exciting move. In
okay,
general, all of the proposals that did really well really centered people with disabilities, and that is the thing that I would take away in the future is like, how are you centering people with disabilities in your project actively? And those are the proposals that really stood out, and the panels really
right.
were excited about awarding.
Okay, with about a minute left in that, any other topics, thoughts you could think about as far as the arts and disabilities and that?
Sure. I want to point out that MRAC has a series of new grant programs this year intended to be much more flexible than we have been in the past, finding ways to make our application simpler, and to really make a space for organizations to apply for what they need. There's a program called Flexible Support, really very open-ended. What do you need to make art? And then there's the Equity Response Grant, which is specifically money set aside for communities that typically experience marginalization or have inequitable access to the arts, specifically Black, Indigenous, people of color led groups led by LGBTQIA2+
Okay.
communities, and then those led by people with disabilities. So if you're a disability-led organization, please check into the Equity Response Grant on our website.
Yeah, I was just going to say, people wanting information, definitely check out the website mrac.org. And I want to thank you again, Scott. It was great catching up with you. If there's anything that any videos or anything of importance you would like to get out, feel free to contact us, because we most definitely would love to post it on Disability Channel Minnesota. So once again, it was nice seeing you again, Scott, and you take care.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, bye-bye.